So there's that. There's that kind of thing, and then you have television. You have TV hosts that talk about it. You have historians that are talking about it. You have military officials. You have philosophers like Sun Tzu and Musashi Miyamoto. You have martial artists. You have movie writers and directors. These are the individuals who have taken up the responsibility of helping the general population to explore this language that the academic world has largely left untouched, especially in academic environments for teenagers. I know because I remember my experience as a teenager when I was studying these subjects. They didn't go into the same depth that the shows did. So, and this is especially true for like cases like, and I said cyclical violence being one of the more, one of the repeating approaches to understanding violence and depicting it. It wasn't just Naruto who did this. Before Naruto even entered the ring, there was Babylon 5. Babylon 5 did a very excellent job demonstrating what a cycle of hate looks like by using the characters of Londo Mollari and Jakar. It's a great television show. I highly recommend it. But I'm only going through all this to make the point that we, as people, have decided, like the academic world has essentially decided that the job of helping people, men, young people who have violent tendencies, that the job of somehow coping and handling this or rising above it or whatever, that has been assigned to individuals who, for the most part, are not actually completely affiliated with the academic world. Mangaka do not have a direct affiliation with the academic world. TV hosts don't. Military officials do not. Philosophers, especially dead philosophers, have absolutely nothing to do with it because they're not even here anymore. It's just their legacy and their ideas that we've been left with. Martial artists, while they may, be college students, they may go to some of them may even work at institutions. They are not directly a part of this. And yet they often have taken up the responsibility of explaining to men that it's okay to walk away from a fight. They've had to help men with not only their violent tendencies, but some masculinity issues. Like, you learn the martial arts. I've heard people say you learn the martial arts, you don't have to use it, or you learn when it's appropriate to use this force, when it's not. Like this is something that they've had to do. And you have a similar situation with coaches who are in football and boxing or whatever. They have to find some way to channel this aggression into something that is not going to intentionally hurt innocent people. In other words, they try to get people who have these aggressive tendencies, who have the ability to be violent, to get into the same environment together and to try to find some kind of constructive activity that aids in their physical health, their mental well-being as much as possible, and that teaches them how to use it appropriately. In other words, in context. Because violence can sometimes escape and enter into any context in human life. That's the problem with violence. Movie writers, all the time. If you need an example of it, almost every movie I've ever seriously remembered has some kind of violence to it. Like you had Pocahontas. It was not historically accurate, and yet the messaging was pretty clear. Obviously, you have directors who talk about violence. The Star Wars movies are an infamous example of talking about where violence can lead, how it can even manifest itself. Where does this come from? What are the consequences? These are the types of individuals who are usually given that responsibility. And the question that I have to ask to the Gynarchy community as well as to others is that a responsibility that only them should largely shoulder? Is that a burden that they should shoulder? Or is that something that maybe we can do something about? Maybe it's not a good idea, because what happens if you have authors and writers who are putting things in these materials that are either not appropriate or that don't extensively cover the language of violence. For instance, while many of these shows have a tendency to cover violence, it tends to be violence within, it tends to be certain kinds. So, in other words, a lot of stuff pertaining to sexual violence or sexual abuse is usually left out. Violence against women and girls, specifically because of their sex, because of, like DV is usually left out of the topic. It's even more rare when you have an author like that. I found it very repulsive, but it was not depicted in a positive light. And it was in the manga Berserk, where the main character, as a child, was being, let's just say, violated by an older man. And this was one of the things that contributed to his trauma and that fucked him up growing up. So it's very rare to have these discussions or to include these things because the subject material is so touchy, but also because sometimes we just don't know if there's any good way to go about doing it. How do you explore these kinds of things, right? There are only two anime titles that I can think of that explore sexual violence that is directed at minors. One of them is Berserk. The other is Black Lagoon. I can't think of anybody else, any other authors, who either had the nerve, the audacity, or the desire to show how this kind of content can destroy the lives of these young people and turn them into monsters later on in life. No one else wants to touch it. And I can understand why. Because you don't want to sexualize the content. However, at the same time, this is a real world problem. And it's the same thing with how women are treated when the curtains are closed, when no one else is in the room. There is more of an emphasis on public conflict, especially in academic environments. There is a bigger emphasis on public violence, violence taking place out in the open, versus the violence that is taking place in the home. Whatever that kind of violence is, that violence is not only underscored, it's not talked anywhere near much about in the academic world, but it's still part of violence. It's still part of the human experience. And yet people are just like, yeah, we talk about battlefields because out in the open. We talk about riots out in the open, right? We talk about many of these incidents, but when it comes to the academic world, they're like, well, that stuff about domestic violence, well, we're not really going to touch on that. Yeah, but we have half of the population as women, and many of them are suffering from domestic violence. It's part of our past. Why are the public battles more important than the private ones? Why are they the ones that are getting the spotlight and the private ones get very, very rarely mentioned, or it's like watered down to like, oh yeah, these Japanese soldiers just went over to this place one day and decided to rape a bunch of people. Okay, moving on. Now let's go to the next thing. It's like, well, what do you mean? What do you mean? Did they go inside their homes? Did they just did they take them out of their homes? And it's like, what about the fact that men are doing this behind closed doors? And I think part of the problem with the way historical violence is presented is it's always presented in a way to where like there's two opposing sides and everything is focused on these opposing sides, but not necessarily on the ongoing violence that happens regardless of whether you're in a war or not. War escalates it, but there's ongoing violence happening inside homes in the United States and around the world. And yet, how often is it getting brought up? That's why I feel like there has to be a academic subject like the language of violence, because you have to. I feel like if you're only covering part of the story, you're missing all of the rest. Why should some content concerning violence be more concerning or deserve more time than other kinds of violence? How is that appropriate? And how is that fair to women and to girls and the things that they go through? It almost seems as if they are creating a bias in favor of the violence that they feel is exciting or awesome or relevant, and everything else that doesn't fit into that doesn't concern narratives, that doesn't matter, right? At least not to them. But that's how it looks. I'm not saying that's their intention. I'm just saying that's how it fucking looks. It's like, okay, well, what about all this other crap? And I think I think part of the underlying issue too is that it's a lot easier to win a battle or to win a war than it is to actually change yourself as a person or for people as a collective to change. I think that's like like the internal battle is different, and the private battles are not only talked about differently, sometimes they're not even mentioned at all, or people rarely ever speak about them except in interpersonal conversations. So I'm going to go back over to my notes. So I guess the question then is, trying to do this. The question is, if you're going to teach violence in a classroom, right? If you're going to actually go through and talk about it, there's going to be questions of how to present violence. In other words, is too much gore a bad thing? In other words, do we need to be careful with how we are presenting gory material, bloody material? We have to think about the effect, of course, that violence may have on some people who are very impressionable. And yet at the same time, we also face another problem. Some people would say, well, maybe they're too young for this. Well, the problem with that, of course, is that there are many men who are letting young men get on the internet and they're being exposed to things. They're watching MMA fights at like 10 or 9 years old, boxing matches. They get to see grown men tackling each other. They get to see injuries during football games. They get to see people getting hit in the face with baseballs or whatever, or tagged. You know, there's all sorts of violence they're being exposed to from a very young age, and there's not really a whole lot of attempts to police how they get a hold of this content. And with, like, I know Australia recently banned social media for kids like 16 and under, I think. That's a great thing. That's a good start. I think it should have been 18 and under. But I guess we have to disagree. But okay, back to what I was saying. There is this thing where I know, because I had a parent who, when my mother left the room, he taught me how to form a fist. But I didn't have a moral compass. I didn't have a moral backbone or structure then. So teaching me how to fight and to be violent simply for the sake of just defending myself was not a good idea, because I didn't know when it was or wasn't appropriate yet. And I was still developing, because you're at a stage of life where you're not fully ready yet. I think most men aren't finished developing until they're like 25 years old. So there's obviously going to be that. We also have to talk about nonviolent communication. I think nonviolent communication skills should be taught to every male the second they hit 13. Because you are going to be a lot significantly stronger than you were before. Your capacity to actually inflict harm will be far greater. So I think learning nonviolent communication skills is a thing. When I was in a relationship with a previous person, they suggested that I learned this kind of communication and that it would benefit my life. Well, I think it could benefit all men. So topics about violence don't necessarily have to just be about depicting it. It's like, well, what can we do about it? How can we reduce violence? How can we have conversations about these consequences without getting too much into it? And what can we do to get people to understand why nonviolent communication is important? And then, of course, you have de-escalation tactics, which thankfully some martial artists teach their students. They teach them how to talk people out of fighting, or to try to not use language to intentionally escalate a conflict between yourself and another individual or individuals. In other words, they're teaching the value of being respectful, of knowing what not to do, and even knowing how to dial down the temperature in the room, which is, I've heard them say, hey, try to volunteer to buy them some beer or something, or try to do something nice, because then maybe they're just having a really bad day. These are good ideas, but they have to learn them by going to martial arts. And there's another problem presented here. I'm going to go into that in a moment.